She is not even fighting anymore. Bennett Graves whispered these words to his attorney without taking his eyes off the woman sitting across the courtroom. His wife of 18 years had not looked up in over an hour. Her shoulders curved inward like someone bracing against a wind that would not stop blowing. The simple charcoal dress she wore hung loose on her frame, and her hands rested motionless in her lap, fingers occasionally twisting a thin silver bracelet that caught the morning light. She used to wear diamonds, Bennett thought. Now she cannot even afford to dress properly for her own divorce. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and recycled air. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in the same unflattering pallor. At the plaintiff's table, Margot Sinclair sat beside a young woman from the Legal Aid Society who looked like she had not slept in 3 days. The attorney shuffled through papers with the desperate energy of someone who knew she was outmatched but had not yet accepted defeat. Bennett adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a subtle gesture that drew attention to the watch on his wrist. The timepiece alone cost more than most people earned in a year. He had bought it to celebrate the closing of his Singapore tower, and he wore it today deliberately. Everything about his appearance was deliberate. The charcoal suit cut to emphasize his still athletic frame. The silver at his temples that he had decided to embrace rather than hide. The quiet confidence of a man who had built a $2.3 billion empire from nothing and intended to keep every cent of it. Beside him, Celia Monroe arranged documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who destroyed lives professionally and slept soundly afterward. She charged $800 an hour, and Bennett considered it the best investment he had ever made. The prenuptial agreement is airtight, Celia murmured without looking up. And after the evidence we submitted regarding her extracurricular activities, she will be lucky to walk away with bus fare. Bennett allowed himself a small smile. He was already mentally planning his evening. Katerina would be waiting at the penthouse, champagne chilling, ready to celebrate his freedom. By this time tomorrow, Margot Sinclair would be nothing more than a footnote in his biography. The quiet, forgettable woman he had married when he was young and foolish enough to believe that loyalty mattered more than ambition. Judge Harold Morrison cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention back to the bench. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many marriages dissolve into acrimony. He shuffled through the papers before him, occasionally glancing at Margot with something that might have been sympathy. The court has reviewed the prenuptial agreement submitted by counsel for the defendant, the judge began, as well as the evidence pertaining to the alleged infidelity of the plaintiff. Margot's attorney stood quickly, nearly knocking over a stack of files. Your Honor, my client categorically denies these allegations. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and we believe it has been manufactured to deny her a fair settlement. Judge Morrison held up a hand. Ms. Marsh, I have reviewed the forensic analysis of the digital evidence. The photographs, the hotel records, the recovered text messages. The documentation appears thorough. It is fabricated, the young attorney insisted, her voice rising with desperation. My client was not at the Four Seasons on those dates. She was at a charity function in Connecticut. We have witnesses. Do you have those witnesses present today? The attorney hesitated. We were unable to secure their attendance on such short notice, Your Honor. We request a continuance to gather proper testimony. Denied. Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of finality. You have had 4 months to prepare your case, Counselor. I am prepared to rule. Bennett leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. Across the aisle, Margot had not moved. She sat perfectly still, staring at her hands, as if she had already accepted what was coming. As if she had given up. This is what she always was, Bennett thought. Weak. Passive. A woman who folded under pressure instead of fighting back. He felt nothing but contempt. In light of the evidence presented, Judge Morrison continued, the court is inclined to uphold the prenuptial agreement in its entirety. Mr. Graves will retain sole ownership of Graves Development Corporation and all associated properties. Ms. Sinclair will receive the settlement specified in Article 4 of the agreement, $1.4 million payable over 5 years, and will vacate the Manhattan residence within 30 days. $1.4 million. Bennett almost laughed. It was an insult, and they both knew it. Margot had spent 18 years supporting his career, managing his households, representing his company at charity events. And now she would receive less than what he spent on art acquisitions in a single quarter. "Is there anything else before I issue the final decree?" the judge asked, reaching for his gavel. "No, Your Honor," Celia said smoothly. "The defendant is satisfied with the court's ruling." Bennett drummed his fingers on the table. A rhythm of victory. He was already composing the text message he would send to Katerina. "It is done. Open the champagne." "Actually," Ms. Marsh stammered, "we would like to request one final review of the financial disclosure documents." "Denied," the judge repeated, impatience creeping into his voice. "You have had ample opportunity to review all submitted materials." He raised his gavel. And then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. "Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell where you are watching from and what time it is where you are at. If you are new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever." The sound of those doors opening cut through the courtroom like a blade. Every head turned toward the back of the room, drawn by the authority of the interruption. A woman stood in the doorway. She appeared to be in her mid-70s, with silver hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from marble. Her posture was perfectly straight, almost military in its precision. She wore a dark suit that was clearly expensive but utterly understated, the kind of clothing chosen by someone who had no need to announce their wealth. Behind her stood a younger man in a similar suit, carrying a leather satchel that appeared heavy with documents. But it was her eyes that commanded attention. Gray and penetrating, they swept across the courtroom with the measured assessment of someone cataloging every detail for later use. Bennett felt a flicker of irritation. The woman looked vaguely familiar, but he could not immediately place her. "Who is that?" he whispered to Celia. His attorney did not answer. Bennett glanced at her and felt something cold settle in his chest. Celia Monroe, the woman who had spent 30 years demolishing opponents in courtrooms across Manhattan, had gone completely pale. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as they rested on her documents. "Celia." Bennett's voice sharpened. "Who is she?" Judge Morrison had risen slightly from his chair, his gavel still suspended in the air. His expression had shifted from irritation to something that looked almost like deference. "Mrs. Sinclair," the judge said, and his booming authority had been replaced by something quieter, more cautious. The woman in the doorway did not immediately respond. She walked down the center aisle with measured steps, her low heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady rhythm. She did not look at Bennett. She did not acknowledge the judge. She walked directly to the plaintiff's table, to the woman sitting with her head bowed and her spirit apparently broken. Margot finally looked up. The expression on her face was not relief. It was something more complicated. Surprise and shame and resignation, all tangled together. "Hello, Mother," Margot said quietly. Bennett's mind raced. Mother. This was Irene, Margot's mother. The retired librarian from that nothing town in Vermont. The pleasant, unremarkable woman who had sat silently at their wedding 18 years ago and barely spoken 2 words to anyone. The woman who sent those dreadful fruitcakes every Christmas and puttered around in gardens and had never, in Bennett's estimation, accomplished anything of significance in her entire life. But the woman standing in the courtroom now did not look like a retired librarian. She radiated authority. The air around her seemed to crackle with it. "You should have called me sooner," Irene said to her daughter. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I wanted to handle it myself," Margot replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Irene's gaze swept across the courtroom, taking in Bennett's expensive suit, Celia's frozen expression, the judge's suspended gavel. "And how has that worked out for you, my dear?" Bennett could not stay silent any longer. This was ridiculous. This was his moment of triumph, and he would not allow it to be interrupted by some elderly relative with delusions of importance. "Your Honor," he said, standing up with an aggressive adjustment of his jacket. "This is a closed proceeding. I do not know who this woman thinks she is, but she cannot simply walk into a courtroom and interrupt a legal ruling. I demand she be removed immediately." Judge Morrison did not respond. He was looking at Irene with an expression that Bennett could not quite read. Celia grabbed Bennett's sleeve with surprising force. "Sit down," she hissed. "What? No." Bennett pulled away. "This is absurd. She is a retired librarian, for God's sake. She has no standing here." Irene Sinclair finally turned her gaze toward Bennett. The full force of those gray eyes hit him like a physical blow. There was no anger in her expression. No visible emotion at all. Just a cold, clinical assessment, like a surgeon deciding where to make the first incision. "A librarian," Irene repeated, and the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. "Yes, I suppose that is what my daughter told you. I do enjoy libraries. I also spent 25 years investigating financial crimes for the federal government." She paused, letting the words settle over the room like a winter frost. "But I am sure you knew that already, Mr. Graves. I am sure you conducted thorough research into your wife's family before you married her. That is what intelligent businessmen do, is it not?" Bennett felt his mouth go dry. He looked at Celia, whose expression had shifted from pale to something approaching genuine fear. Judge Morrison finally lowered his gavel without striking it. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said carefully, "I was not aware you were related to the plaintiff." "The name threw you off," Irene replied. "Sinclair, not Graves. My daughter kept her maiden name professionally, though she took her husband's name socially. A decision she may come to regret less than she anticipated." Irene gestured to the young man behind her, who stepped forward and began unpacking documents from the leather satchel. "I am entering an appearance on behalf of my daughter," Irene continued, "and I am bringing new counsel. Mr. Wainwright is a former investigator with the Department of Justice. He will be handling the remainder of these proceedings." The young man leaned over and whispered something to Ms. Marsh, the exhausted legal aid attorney. Her eyes widened. She looked at the folded check he had pressed into her hand, nodded frantically, and began gathering her belongings. "This is highly irregular," Bennett sputtered, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "You cannot simply swap attorneys in the middle of a verdict." The judge was about to rule. "I can," Irene said calmly. "And I just did." She turned to Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, given the new evidence I am prepared to present, I request a recess to allow the court to review the materials." Judge Morrison looked at Bennett, then at Celia, then at Irene. Whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes, it resolved quickly. "The court will recess for 1 hour," he announced. "When we reconvene, I expect all parties to be prepared to proceed in an orderly fashion." His gavel finally struck the wooden block, but the sound no longer felt like victory. Bennett watched as Judge Morrison practically fled from the bench, disappearing into his chambers with visible relief. The courtroom erupted into confused murmurs as spectators tried to understand what had just happened. Bennett turned on Celia, his face flushing with anger. "What the hell is going on? Who is she really?" Celia was already packing her briefcase, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "You told me her family was nobody," she said, her voice tight. "You told me her mother was a retired librarian with no connections. You said there was nothing to worry about." "There is nothing to worry about." Bennett grabbed her arm, forcing her to look at him. "So she worked for the government." "So what?" "That was decades ago. She is 74 years old. She cannot change the facts of the case. We have the prenup. We have the evidence of infidelity. The law is the law." Celia looked at him with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and disgust. "Bennett," she said slowly, as if explaining something to a child, "Irene Sinclair is not just some former government employee. She was the Director of Financial Crimes Enforcement for the Federal Reserve. Before that, she spent 15 years at the Department of Justice specializing in complex fraud investigations. Her colleagues called her the quiet collector because she never raised her voice, but she always recovered what was owed." Celia swallowed hard. She brought down Pemberton Holdings in '92. She testified before Congress during the savings and loan crisis. She was offered the position of SEC Commissioner 3 times and turned it down because she said the job would be too political. Bennett felt something cold spreading through his chest, but he refused to acknowledge it. That was all years ago, he said. She retired. She grows tomatoes now. Men like Irene Sinclair do not retire, Celia replied. They wait. Bennett looked across the courtroom to where Irene stood beside her daughter. The older woman had one hand resting protectively on Margot's shoulder, speaking quietly to her while her associate spread documents across the table in neat, organized rows. As if sensing his gaze, Irene looked up. She met Bennett's eyes across the room and held them without blinking. Then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not even a threatening smile. It was simply the expression of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and found them all acceptable. Bennett looked away first. We need to settle, Celia said urgently. Right now. We go over there. We offer her half of everything. Maybe if we act quickly, she will let you keep control of the company. Half? Bennett laughed, though the sound was hollow. I am not giving that woman a penny more than what is in the prenup. I do not care who her mother is. You should care, Celia said. Because I am telling you right now, Irene Sinclair does not enter a courtroom unless she already knows the outcome. She did not come here to argue the case. She came here to end you. Bennett straightened his tie and fixed his expression into something resembling confidence. You are being dramatic, he said. This is just intimidation tactics. She has nothing. If she had anything real, she would have brought it months ago. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Katerina. Slight delay. Some family drama from the in-laws. Annoying but harmless. Keep the champagne cold. He pressed send and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He had no idea that the phone he held, the empire he had built, the life he had constructed so carefully, was already compromised. The trap had been laid months ago. Bennett was simply the last person to realize he had already walked into it. The hour passed like minutes. When they reconvened, the atmosphere in courtroom 4C had transformed completely. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with anticipation. The few spectators who remained sat forward in their seats, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Irene Sinclair sat at the plaintiff's table with the calm stillness of a woman who had done this hundreds of times before. Her hands rested on the leather portfolio in front of her, and she did not fidget, did not shuffle papers, did not confer with her associate. She simply waited. Margot sat beside her mother, and something about her had changed as well. She still wore the same simple dress, still had the same weary lines around her eyes. But her shoulders were straighter now. Her chin was lifted. She looked like a woman who had remembered something important about herself. Judge Morrison returned to the bench with considerably more caution than he had shown earlier. He settled into his chair, arranged his papers, and cleared his throat. The court is back in session, he announced. Mrs. Sinclair, you indicated you have new evidence to present regarding this matter. I do, Your Honor. Irene stood, but unlike most attorneys, she did not approach the bench. She commanded the room perfectly well from where she was. I have 3 matters to address. First, I will demonstrate that the evidence of infidelity submitted by the defendant's counsel is fabricated. Second, I will show that Mr. Graves himself has violated the morality clause of the prenuptial agreement he now seeks to enforce. Third, I will present evidence of financial arrangements that fundamentally alter the nature of this proceeding. Your Honor, Celia interjected, rising from her chair. This is nothing more than a fishing expedition. My client's personal life is not on trial. Irene turned her gray eyes toward Celia with an expression of mild interest. Ms. Monroe, she said, you are a named partner at Monroe and Whitfield. You have practiced family law for 27 years. You know perfectly well that when a prenuptial agreement contains a morality clause, the personal conduct of both parties becomes directly relevant to the distribution of assets. She paused. Unless you are suggesting that the morality clause should only apply to wives and not to husbands. Celia sat down without responding. Irene turned back to the judge. Let us begin with the infidelity allegations. My daughter was accused of conducting an affair based on photographs taken at the Four Seasons Hotel on February 8th and 9th of this year. The evidence appeared conclusive. Time-stamped photographs, hotel receipts, recovered text messages. She opened her portfolio and withdrew a thick file. "It is conclusive," Bennett said, unable to stop himself. "We have forensic analysis of the digital evidence." Irene did not look at him. "You have a report purchased from a private investigator named Daniel Cross. Mr. Cross is currently sitting in the hallway outside this courtroom, contemplating the end of his career. He knows that when he is called to testify, he will have to explain why the metadata on those photographs does not match the timestamps displayed in the images." She withdrew a document and handed it to her associate, who delivered it to the bailiff for the judge. "But we do not need Mr. Cross's testimony," Irene continued. "We have physics. The photographs allegedly show my daughter entering room 412 at the Four Seasons at 8:42 in the evening on February 8th. However, if you examine Exhibit A in the file I have just provided, you will find a credit card receipt from the Hartford Children's Hospital Charity Gala in Connecticut, time-stamped 8:30 that same evening. The card belongs to my daughter. The signature is hers." She paused to let the implications settle. "Additionally, I have included security footage from the event showing my daughter at the podium, delivering the keynote address, at 8:45 in the evening." Irene looked at Bennett for the first time since she had begun speaking. "Unless my daughter has somehow developed the ability to be in two places simultaneously, in Manhattan and Connecticut at the same moment, the evidence submitted by your counsel is a fabrication." Bennett felt his face grow hot. He turned to Celia, expecting her to mount some kind of defense, but his attorney was staring at the documents in front of her with an expression of growing horror. "Your Honor," Celia stammered, "we relied on the investigator's report in good faith. We had no reason to believe." "Good faith." Irene's voice remained perfectly level. "Ms. Monroe, you submitted digitally altered photographs to a court of law. You claimed forensic verification for evidence that collapses under the most basic scrutiny. Either you failed to perform due diligence, or you knowingly participated in fraud. Neither option reflects well on your professional judgment." Judge Morrison was flipping through the file Irene had provided, his expression darkening with each page. "The evidence of infidelity is stricken from the record," he announced. "The motion to deny equitable distribution based on this evidence is denied." Bennett gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. "This is a setup," he said, his voice rising. "She is manipulating the court. Someone doctored those photographs to frame me. Mr. Graves." Judge Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "You will remain silent unless directly addressed. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." Bennett clenched his jaw and said nothing. Irene continued as if there had been no interruption. "Now, since we are discussing infidelity and since the prenuptial agreement contains a morality clause that applies to both parties, let us examine Mr. Graves' conduct during the marriage." She withdrew another file from her portfolio. Katerina Novak, 28 years old, former model, currently residing in a penthouse at Graves Tower in Manhattan. A property that is listed in company records as a corporate asset, but that has been used exclusively as a private residence for Ms. Novak for the past 18 months. Bennett felt the blood drain from his face. "The lease is in the name of a shell company," Irene continued, "but the payments can be traced directly to the household account that Mr. Graves shared with my daughter. In addition to the apartment, Mr. Graves has provided Ms. Novak with a Porsche Taycan, various pieces of jewelry totaling approximately $200,000, and consulting fees paid to a company that appears to have no employees, no office, and no discernible business purpose." She placed a photograph on the evidence pile. This photograph was taken 3 weeks ago at Mr. Graves' property in the Maldives. The same property he claimed in his deposition was unused during the marriage due to renovation work. Bennett stared at the photograph. It showed him and Katerina on the deck of his villa, champagne glasses in hand, her arm draped across his shoulders. They were both laughing. They looked happy. "Someone was following me," he said, his voice strangled. "This is illegal surveillance." The photograph was taken by a real estate photographer who was documenting the property for insurance purposes, Irene replied calmly. Mr. Graves apparently forgot that he had scheduled the appointment. The photographer was quite surprised to find the villa occupied. She turned back to Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, Mr. Graves used joint marital assets to fund a relationship with another woman for at least 2 years. He lied under oath about the use of marital properties. He fabricated evidence to destroy my daughter's reputation. Any one of these actions would be sufficient to void the prenuptial agreement under the morality clause he himself insisted upon. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. The prenuptial agreement is voided, he announced. We will proceed with equitable distribution of assets according to state law.
No.
Bennett was on his feet before he realized he had moved. You cannot do this. That agreement was ironclad. My attorneys spent months drafting it. Your attorneys apparently spent less time drafting it than my team spent reading it, Irene replied. But the prenuptial agreement is only the beginning of our concerns. She paused, and something shifted in her expression. The clinical detachment remained, but beneath it, Bennett could see something colder. Something patient and implacable. Let us discuss how Graves Development Corporation became successful in the first place. Bennett felt a chill run down his spine. I built that company from nothing, he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. I took a single rental property and turned it into a global empire. You took a single rental property, Irene agreed. And then, 11 years ago, you received a $40 million investment from a consortium of European investors. She let the words hang in the air. That consortium was me. The courtroom went completely silent. Margot's head snapped toward her mother, her eyes wide with shock. Whatever she had expected Irene to reveal, this was clearly not it. Bennett stood frozen, his mind racing through the implications. 11 years ago. The bridge funding that had saved his company from bankruptcy. The anonymous investors who had asked for nothing except equity and patience. That is impossible, he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. You are a retired government employee. You could not possibly have had that kind of capital. The Sinclair family has managed substantial assets for 4 generations, Irene replied. We do not collect headlines or yachts. We prefer to remain invisible. But our resources are considerable. She looked at her daughter. 11 years ago, Margot called me in tears. She told me that her brilliant husband was about to lose everything because his development projects had stalled. She begged me to help. And she begged me never to let you know where the money came from. Irene's voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been sorrow. She knew your pride could not survive the truth. She knew that if you discovered your success was built on her family's money, you would resent her for it. So she asked me to remain invisible. To pretend to be nothing more than a retired librarian who grew tomatoes and sent Christmas fruitcakes. Bennett looked at Margot. She was staring at her mother with an expression he could not read. I believed in you, Irene continued. Or rather, I believed in what my daughter saw in you. So I structured an investment that would remain hidden. I agreed to her terms. Her voice hardened. But I am not a fool, Mr. Graves. I have spent my career watching men like you. I know how you operate. I know what you do to the people who trust you with their resources. So I included protective clauses in the investment agreement. She opened another file. If the marriage dissolved due to natural causes, mutual agreement, irreconcilable differences, the investment would convert to a standard equity position. My family would remain silent partners, and you would never know the truth. She looked at Bennett with those cold gray eyes. But if the marriage dissolved due to demonstrated bad faith, infidelity, fraud, deliberate cruelty. She let the pause stretch until the silence became unbearable. The investment reverts to the original holder, with accumulated interest, and with a proportional claim on all assets developed with those funds. Bennett felt his legs go weak. He gripped the edge of the table to keep himself upright. By my team's calculation, Irene continued, that represents approximately 62% of Graves Development Corporation's current portfolio. 62%. More than half of everything he had built. Everything he had worked for. Everything he had sacrificed his marriage to protect. You cannot do this, he said, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. I am not doing anything, Irene replied. You did this to yourself. You signed the investment agreement without reading the fine print. You assumed that anonymous investors were simply stupid money, too unsophisticated to protect themselves. You never bothered to investigate where the funding came from because you were too proud to question your own success. She closed her portfolio with a soft click. And now you have provided more than sufficient evidence of bad faith. Fabricated evidence against your wife. Misuse of marital assets. Perjury under oath. You have triggered every protective clause I wrote into that agreement. Bennett turned to Celia, desperate for some kind of lifeline. She cannot do this. Tell her she cannot do this. There must be some legal defense. But Celia Monroe was no longer sitting at the table. She was standing, gathering her briefcase, her face pale and drawn. Where are you going? I am withdrawing as counsel, Celia said without looking at him. I can represent you in a divorce, Mr. Graves. I cannot represent you in what appears to be developing into a complex financial fraud investigation. She walked toward the door. You cannot leave, Bennett called after her. I am paying you. Celia paused at the threshold. You were paying me, she said. Past tense. The door closed behind her, and Bennett was alone at the defendant's table. He looked around the courtroom, searching for allies and finding none. The bailiff was studiously avoiding his gaze. Judge Morrison was reviewing documents with an expression of barely concealed disgust. The few spectators who remained were watching him with the morbid fascination of people observing an accident in progress. And across the aisle, Margot was looking at him with something he had never seen in her eyes before. Not anger. Not triumph. Something quieter and more devastating. Recognition. She was seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time in their marriage. And what she saw had finally broken whatever loyalty she had still harbored. We are not finished, Irene said, her voice cutting through Bennett's spiraling thoughts. He looked at her, this woman he had dismissed for 18 years, this quiet presence at the edges of his life whom he had never bothered to understand. What else could there possibly be? Irene did not smile, but something shifted in her expression. A subtle hardening, like steel cooling after being forged. While investigating the source of funds for my daughter's settlement, my team conducted a thorough analysis of Graves Development Corporation's public financial statements. We noticed certain irregularities that warranted further examination. Bennett felt his heart stop. The profit margins reported in your quarterly filings do not align with industry standards, Irene continued. The depreciation schedules are inconsistent. And there are substantial discrepancies between your reported earnings and your actual cash flow. This has nothing to do with the divorce, Bennett said, but his voice had gone thin and reedy. This is a private family matter. You have no right to investigate my business. I have every right, Irene replied. As a significant stakeholder in your company, which I became the moment you triggered those reversion clauses, I have not only the right but the fiduciary responsibility to investigate financial irregularities. She turned to Judge Morrison. Your Honor, I have filed a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding potential securities fraud at Graves Development Corporation. I submitted the documentation this morning, approximately 1 hour before this hearing resumed. Bennett felt the floor drop away beneath him. The SEC, he repeated, his voice barely audible. Additionally, Irene continued, I have requested that this court freeze all of Mr. Graves' personal assets pending a full forensic audit of the company's financial statements. Given the evidence of fraud already presented in this proceeding, I believe the court has sufficient grounds to grant this request. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. The request is granted. All assets belonging to Mr. Bennett Graves, including but not limited to real estate, investment portfolios, and corporate holdings, are frozen effective immediately pending the completion of a forensic audit. You cannot do this, Bennett shouted, finally losing control. I am Bennett Graves. I have 70,000 employees. I am on the cover of business magazines. You cannot just freeze my assets based on the word of some retired bureaucrat with a grudge. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked against the bench. Mr. Graves, you are hereby held in contempt of court. One more outburst and I will have you removed. Bennett fell silent, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. Irene watched him with an expression that might have been pity. I understand this is difficult, she said quietly. You have spent your entire life believing that you were the smartest person in any room. That the rules applied to other people, lesser people, but not to you. That you could take whatever you wanted and discard whatever you no longer needed without consequence. She shook her head slowly. That is not how the world works, Mr. Graves. Actions have consequences. Cruelty has consequences. And the people you dismiss as unimportant have a way of becoming very important when you least expect it. She gathered her portfolio and turned toward her daughter. We have a great deal to discuss, Margot. But first, we should let Mr. Graves process what has happened here today. Margot stood slowly, steadier on her feet than she had been in months. She looked at Bennett one last time, and when she spoke, her voice was calm. I used to wonder what I did wrong. Why you stopped seeing me. Why nothing I did was ever enough. I thought if I just tried harder, if I made myself smaller, if I became exactly what you wanted, maybe you would love me again. She paused, and something like peace settled over her features. But it was never about what I did. It was about who you are. And I am done trying to be small enough to fit into your life. She turned and walked toward the door, her mother beside her. Bennett watched them go. He wanted to call out, to say something that would stop this nightmare from continuing. But no words came. The courtroom doors closed behind them, and Bennett Graves was left alone at the defendant's table, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had built on lies. To understand how Bennett Graves had arrived at this moment of destruction, we must go back 18 years. To a different man. A different marriage. A different set of promises. They met at a construction site. It was hardly the most romantic setting. The building that would become Bennett's first boutique hotel was still a skeleton of steel beams and concrete, plastic sheeting flapping in the October wind. But Margot Sinclair did not see the chaos of construction. She saw potential. She had been hired to consult on art acquisitions, to select pieces that would transform empty corridors into spaces worth remembering. At 34, she was at the height of her professional powers. Curator at a respected gallery. Published in 3 academic journals. Sought after by developers who understood that a thoughtful art collection could elevate a property from luxury to legendary. Bennett was 38, hungry in a way that showed in his eyes. He had leveraged everything he owned to purchase this crumbling building in a neighborhood that everyone said was too far from anywhere that mattered. But he had vision. He could see what the neighborhood would become. He was betting his future on being right. He was touring the construction site with his contractors when Margot arrived. She wore practical clothes, boots suitable for navigating debris, and carried a portfolio of suggestions under one arm. She did not apologize for interrupting. She simply nodded at him and began explaining her ideas, speaking with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Bennett found himself listening. This space here, she said, pointing to what would become the lobby. You are planning to fill it with something large and impressive. Something that announces wealth. He nodded. Do not do that, she said. People who stay in boutique hotels are not interested in being impressed. They want to be intrigued. They want to feel that they have discovered something. Give them smaller pieces, arranged to reward attention. Make them feel like explorers, not spectators. Bennett had spent months working with designers who told him what they thought he wanted to hear. This woman was telling him what she believed was true. He liked that. They spent 3 hours together that day, walking through the skeletal building while she painted pictures of what each space could become. Her vision aligned with his in ways he had not expected. She understood that luxury was not about excess but about intention. Every detail mattered. Every choice told a story. At the end of the tour, he asked her to stay for dinner. She said yes. Looking back, Margot would wonder about that moment. The yes that changed everything. She had been on the verge of declining. She made it a rule not to socialize with clients. Professional boundaries existed for a reason. But there was something about Bennett Graves that drew her in. An intensity. A certainty about his own future that seemed to bend reality around it. She wanted to be near that kind of conviction. She wanted to see what he would build. And so she said yes. They were married 7 months later. The wedding was small and elegant, exactly what Margot wanted. A historic inn in Vermont, autumn leaves blazing red and gold beyond the windows, 60 guests who actually knew them. Bennett had suggested something larger, a destination event that would announce their union to the business community. But Margot had gently pushed back, and he had relented. She thought it was a good sign. She thought he was a man who could compromise. Irene attended, of course. She sat in the front row during the ceremony, watching with those sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. Bennett barely noticed her. He shook her hand, exchanged the minimum required pleasantries, and filed her away under irrelevant. She was just the mother-in-law. A retired government worker of some kind. Pleasant enough, but clearly not someone who moved in the circles that mattered. If he had bothered to investigate, even slightly, he would have discovered the truth. But Bennett Graves had never been curious about anything that did not directly advance his ambitions. And Margot's family seemed to offer nothing of value. So he did not ask. And Irene did not volunteer. The irony would not become apparent for another 18 years. The first years of the marriage were good. Or at least, Margot believed they were good. She continued her work at the gallery, expanded her consulting practice, published papers that were well received in academic circles. Bennett's hotel opened to rave reviews, and he immediately began planning his next project. They were both busy. They understood each other's ambition. It felt like partnership. The changes came gradually, so gradually that Margot did not recognize them for what they were. It started with small requests. Could she attend a dinner with potential investors? They were traditional, and Bennett thought having his wife present would help seal the deal. Could she review the design materials for the new property? Her eye for aesthetics was invaluable, and the designers he had hired were disappointing him. Each request seemed reasonable. Each one was framed as a compliment. He needed her. He valued her. Her skills made his work better. She did not notice that her own work was quietly slipping away. The gallery needed a full-time curator, and Margot could no longer commit to the hours. She transitioned to consulting only, which quickly became occasional consulting, which eventually became nothing at all. The academic journals stopped receiving her submissions. Her professional reputation, once carefully cultivated, began to fade. By the 5th year of their marriage, Margot Graves had become exactly what Bennett needed her to be. A hostess. A manager. A representative of his brand at charity galas and industry events. She had become invisible. The criticism crept in alongside the transformation. At first, it was subtle. A raised eyebrow when she expressed an opinion. A correction delivered in front of colleagues, framed as teasing but sharp underneath. Actually, Bennett would say, smiling his charming smile, Margot is wonderful with aesthetics, but the business side has never been her strong suit. Leave the numbers to those of us who understand them. Everyone would laugh. Margot would smile along, pretending she had not felt the blade slip between her ribs. Later, the pretense of teasing would disappear entirely. "You wore that dress to the Peterson dinner?" he asked once, looking at her with undisguised disappointment. "I suppose it was fine. They are not sophisticated enough to notice." She changed immediately. She tried to remember what he liked, what he approved of. She monitored her choices constantly, filtering every decision through the question of whether Bennett would approve. She became smaller. The 18th anniversary dinner was when Margot first knew for certain that her husband was having an affair. She had suspected for months. The late nights that never quite added up. The business trips that stretched longer than necessary. The way he reached for his phone the moment it buzzed, angling the screen away from her. But she had not allowed herself to know. Knowing would require action, and she was no longer certain she had the strength for action. That night, Bennett had forgotten the anniversary entirely. He arrived home at 9 in the evening, distracted and irritable, and stared at her blankly when she mentioned the date. Was that today? He pulled out his phone, checking his calendar. Damn. I meant to have my assistant send something. It is fine, Margot said, and she was surprised to discover that she meant it. She no longer expected him to remember things that mattered to her. She had adjusted her expectations so low that his failures no longer registered as betrayal. She had dinner waiting. His favorite meal, prepared by the personal chef he had hired but rarely appreciated. She watched him eat in silence, his attention fixed on his phone, occasionally grunting responses to her attempts at conversation. And then she saw the text message. He had set his phone on the table between bites, screen facing up. A message appeared, just for a moment before he grabbed the device and turned it over. "Miss you already. Tonight was perfect." Margot said nothing. She finished her dinner. She cleared the dishes. She went to her study and quietly began documenting everything she could find. She did not know why she was doing it. Some instinct from a former life, perhaps. The practical, competent woman she had been before Bennett had slowly erased her. That woman understood that knowledge was protection. That woman would want evidence. So Margot began to collect it. Credit card statements. Calendar irregularities. Photographs from social media where Bennett appeared in the background with a woman who was not his wife. Small details that individually meant nothing but together painted an unmistakable picture. She put it all in a folder. She hid the folder in her study. And she said nothing, because saying something would force a confrontation. And confrontation would mean leaving. And leaving would mean admitting that 18 years of her life had been a mistake. She was not ready for that. Not yet. Instead, she called her mother. "Hello, my darling." Irene's voice was warm despite the late hour. "How was your anniversary dinner?" Margot was silent for a long moment. "He forgot," she finally said. "And I found something, I think. I am not sure what I am going to do about it." Irene did not ask what she had found. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps she had been waiting for this call for years. "What do you want to do?" Irene asked. "I do not know," Margot admitted. "I keep thinking that if I just try harder, if I become more of what he needs." Irene was quiet for a moment. "Margot," she said gently, "you cannot become enough for someone who has decided that you are nothing. That is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of vision." His vision. "I know," Margot whispered. "I know." "What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet." Margot took a shaky breath. Just be ready. In case I need you." "I am always ready," Irene said. "Whenever you call." Margot hung up and stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, her husband was probably with another woman. Younger. More exciting. More impressed by his wealth. She should feel angry. She should feel betrayed. Instead, she felt tired. Bone tired. As if she had been running a race for 18 years and had only just realized she was running in circles. Soon, she told herself. Soon I will do something. But 6 more months would pass before Bennett made the decision for her. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. Margot was in the study, reorganizing the bookshelves that she reorganized every few months when she needed to feel useful. The doorbell rang, and the housekeeper answered, and a moment later there was a young man in a suit standing in the doorway with a manila envelope. "Margot Sinclair Graves?" he asked. "Yes." "You have been served." He handed her the envelope and left without another word. She stood in the hallway for a long time, holding the package without opening it. She already knew what it contained. But there was something about the weight of it in her hands, the reality of paper and ink, that made her heart pound. She opened it. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Bennett had filed first. He was seeking an expedited proceeding, citing irreconcilable differences. The prenuptial agreement was attached, along with a proposed settlement that matched the minimum terms they had agreed upon 18 years ago. $1.4 million. Payable over 5 years. After everything she had given. Everything she had sacrificed. Every piece of herself she had surrendered to support his vision. $1.4 million and a notice to vacate the apartment within 30 days. Margot sat down on the floor of the hallway, her back against the wall, and stared at the papers until the words blurred. Then she picked up her phone and called her mother. "It happened," she said. "He filed." Irene's voice was calm, unsurprised. "What do you want to do?" Margot closed her eyes. She thought about the woman she had been at 34. Confident, accomplished, sure of her place in the world. She thought about the woman she had become. Invisible, diminished, so desperate for approval that she had allowed herself to be erased. She thought about the folder hidden in her study, the evidence she had been collecting for months without knowing why. If he had been kind about it, she said slowly. If he had offered something fair. If he had acknowledged what I gave up for him. I would have let it go. I would have walked away quietly. She opened her eyes. But he wants to leave me with nothing. He wants to pretend that 18 years meant nothing. He wants me to disappear without a trace. She took a breath. I am done being invisible, Mama. Irene was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me everything." And Margot did. She told her mother about the affair. About the other woman, the younger woman, the woman who would probably move into Margot's apartment the day she vacated it. She told her about the credit card statements and the business trips and the lies that had accumulated like snow, so gradually that she had not noticed the avalanche building above her. She told her about the prenuptial agreement, the ironclad document that Bennett's lawyers had drafted to protect his assets. She told her about the infidelity clause that could void the agreement, and how Bennett was undoubtedly already building a case to use it against her. Because of course he was. He would never allow himself to be the villain. He would manufacture evidence if necessary to paint her as the unfaithful one, the undeserving one, the one who had broken their sacred vows. He would burn her reputation to protect his fortune. Irene listened without interrupting. When Margot finished, the line was silent for a long moment. Then Irene said, "This will be difficult. What I am about to tell you." "What do you mean?" "There are things you do not know about your father's family," Irene said. "About the resources we have. About the investment I made in Bennett's company 11 years ago." Margot felt the floor shift beneath her. What investment? When his business was failing. When he was on the verge of bankruptcy. You called me crying, begging me to help. You made me promise never to tell him where the money came from. Margot remembered that call. The desperation in her voice. The terror of watching Bennett's dreams collapse around him. She remembered how relieved she had been when the anonymous investors appeared. How Bennett had celebrated his genius for attracting sophisticated capital. "That was you," Margot whispered. "The Sinclair family has resources that we do not discuss publicly," Irene said. "Your father's family built wealth over generations, quietly and carefully. We do not seek attention. We do not announce ourselves. Why did you never tell me?" "You asked me not to," Irene said simply. "You wanted Bennett to believe he had succeeded on his own merits. You knew his pride." Margot laughed, a broken sound. "His pride. I sacrificed everything for his pride." "I know," Irene said. "And I honored your wishes for 11 years. But the investment I made had conditions. Protective clauses that would activate if certain events occurred." "What kind of conditions?" "If Bennett ever demonstrated bad faith in your marriage. Infidelity. Fraud. Deliberate cruelty." Irene's voice hardened. "The investment reverts to me. With interest. And with a proportional claim on everything he built with my money." Margot was silent for a long time. "You built a trap," she finally said. 11 years ago. And you never told me." "I built protection," Irene corrected. "I hoped it would never be needed. I hoped I was wrong about him." She paused. "But I have spent my career watching men like Bennett Graves. I know what they do to the people who trust them. I know how they operate. What happens now?" "Now," Irene said, "you have a choice. You can accept the settlement he is offering. Take the 1.4 million. Walk away quietly. Start over somewhere he cannot touch you. Or we show him who we are. We use the protections I built. We take back what he stole from you. But once we begin, there is no going back. It will become public. It will become ugly. And it will only work if he gives us the evidence we need." "You mean if he lies?" Margot said slowly. "If he fabricates evidence against me." "I believe he will," Irene said. "Men like Bennett cannot admit fault. They will destroy anyone who threatens their narrative. If he has decided you are the villain, he will manufacture whatever evidence is necessary to prove it. And if he does? Then he will have triggered every protection I built into that agreement, Irene said. And we will take everything. Margot stared at the divorce papers scattered on the floor around her. 18 years. She had given him 18 years. She had surrendered her career, her identity, her sense of self. She had watched herself disappear, piece by piece, until she no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. And now he wanted to erase even the memory of her sacrifice. "Do it," she said. "Whatever you need to do. I am ready." Irene was quiet for a moment. "I need you to understand something," she said finally. "Once we begin this, you will see things about Bennett that will be difficult. You will learn things about your marriage that will hurt. And you will have to stand in a courtroom and watch him receive the consequences of his choices." "Good," Margot said, and her voice was steady for the first time in years. "I want to watch." Irene began her investigation the next morning. For 3 months, she and her team worked in silence. Forensic accountants combed through Graves Development Corporation's public filings, identifying discrepancies and irregularities. Private investigators documented Bennett's movements, his expenditures, his relationship with the other woman. They traced the manufactured evidence he was building against Margot. The doctored photographs. The fabricated hotel records. The testimony he was preparing from witnesses who had been paid to lie. And they waited. They waited for Bennett to commit fully to his deception, to submit the false evidence to the court, to perjure himself in depositions. They waited for him to build the case that would destroy him. Margot was not kept informed of the details. Her mother wanted to protect her, to shield her from the ugliness of the investigation until it was necessary for her to know. So Margot waited as well. She attended the divorce proceedings. She sat quietly while Bennett's expensive lawyers painted her as unstable, unfaithful, undeserving. She said nothing when the judge seemed inclined to rule against her. She played the role of the defeated wife so convincingly that even she sometimes forgot it was a performance. And then, on the morning of what should have been her final humiliation, her mother walked into the courtroom. Now, standing in the corridor outside Judge Morrison's chambers, Margot finally allowed herself to breathe. It was over. Or rather, this phase of it was over. Bennett was still inside, alone, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. His lawyer had abandoned him. His assets were frozen. His company was under investigation. His mistress had undoubtedly already seen the news and was calculating how quickly she could distance herself from the wreckage. Everything he had built was crumbling, and he had no one to blame but himself. "Margot," Irene said softly. She turned to her mother, the woman who had waited 11 years to spring a trap she hoped would never be needed. The woman who had pretended to be nothing more than a retired librarian, sending fruitcakes and tending gardens, while secretly holding the keys to Bennett's destruction. "Why did you never tell me?" Margot asked. "About the money. About who you really were." Irene was quiet for a moment. "You asked me not to," she finally said. "You wanted to protect him. You believed that if he knew his success was built on your family's resources, he would resent you for it. I was trying to protect our marriage." "I know," Irene said, "and I honored that. Even when I suspected it was a mistake. Even when I saw him diminishing you, year after year. I waited for you to ask for help." Her eyes were bright. "But you never asked. You kept trying to make it work. You kept believing that if you just tried harder, loved more, sacrificed more, he would finally see you." Margot felt tears prick at her eyes. "I wasted so much time," she whispered. "No." Irene took her daughter's hands. "You loved someone who could not love you back. That is not waste. That is heartbreak. And it is not your fault." They stood in silence for a moment, two women in a courthouse corridor, holding hands while a man's empire collapsed on the other side of the wall. "What happens now?" Margot asked. "Now," Irene said, "we rebuild. The company will need new leadership while the investigation proceeds. The board will want stability. Someone who understands the business, who has been watching it operate for years." She looked at Margot with something like pride. "Someone who knows where the problems are and how to fix them." Margot stared at her mother. You cannot mean me. Why not? You have spent 18 years learning how that company operates. You have read every document, attended every meeting, observed every decision. You understand the business better than anyone except Bennett himself. I was invisible, Margot said. I was just the wife who organized dinner parties. You were never just anything, Irene replied firmly. You made yourself invisible because he needed you to be invisible. But that does not mean you were not watching, learning, preparing. I was not preparing, Margot protested. I never thought. Perhaps not consciously, Irene acknowledged. But some part of you knew this day would come. Some part of you was gathering the knowledge you would need. She squeezed her daughter's hands. The question is not whether you are capable. The question is whether you are willing. Margot thought about the woman she had been at 34. Confident, accomplished, sure of her place in the world. She thought about the woman she had become. Invisible, diminished, convinced that she had nothing to offer. And she thought about the woman she might become. Someone who could take the wreckage of her marriage and build something meaningful from the ashes. It would not be easy. Nothing about the coming months would be easy. There would be investigations and depositions and endless legal proceedings. There would be reporters and rumors and people who believed Bennett's lies about her. But she would not be facing it alone. Yes, Margot said. I am willing. Irene smiled, and for a moment, she did not look like the formidable investigator who had just dismantled a billionaire's life. She looked like a mother, proud of her daughter, hopeful for her future. Then let us begin, she said. They walked toward the elevator together, leaving Bennett Graves alone with the consequences of his choices. The courthouse doors opened onto a Manhattan afternoon that felt too bright, too ordinary for what had just occurred inside. Bennett Graves stumbled down the marble steps, squinting against the autumn sunlight as if emerging from a cave. His hands were shaking. He noticed this with a strange detachment, watching his fingers tremble as he reached for his phone. The device felt foreign in his palm, like something belonging to another man. A man who had walked into this building 3 hours ago believing he was about to celebrate the final dissolution of an inconvenient marriage. That man no longer existed. Bennett scrolled to Katerina's name and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He paced in a tight circle near the fountain at the base of the courthouse steps, willing her to answer. He needed to hear her voice. He needed someone to tell him that this was temporary, that his lawyers would fix it, that he was still Bennett Graves. The call connected. "Baby," he said, and he hated how desperate his voice sounded. Something happened in court. There was a complication. My mother-in-law showed up and made some accusations. It is all nonsense, but my assets are frozen temporarily. I need you to pack a bag. We should go to the house in Bora Bora until this blows over. There was silence on the other end. Not the warm, anticipatory silence of a woman waiting to hear more. A cold silence. Calculating. "Bennett," Katerina finally said, and her voice was stripped of the breathy sweetness she usually affected around him. "I am at Bergdorf's right now. This is not the time for shopping. Did you hear what I said? We need to leave the city." "I tried to use the card you gave me," Katerina continued as if he had not spoken. "The black one. For a Chanel bag I have been wanting. And it was declined." Bennett closed his eyes. The card was tied to his personal account. If his assets were frozen, the card would have been shut down automatically. "It is a bank error," he said. "A temporary hold. It will be sorted out by tomorrow." "I called the bank," Katerina replied. Her voice had gone flat and hard, all pretense of affection stripped away. "They did not say it was a bank error. They said the account had been frozen by court order. And then I checked Twitter." Bennett felt his stomach drop. "It is trending, Bennett. Your name. Your face. Removed as CEO. Fraud allegations. It is everywhere. That is not. Those are lies. My mother-in-law is trying to destroy me because I divorced her daughter." Katerina laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I do not care why it is happening. I care that it is happening. You told me you were untouchable. You told me you had the best lawyers in the city. You told me nothing could go wrong. It will be fixed, Bennett insisted. Give me a few days. I am not giving you anything, Katerina said. Do not call me again. Do not come to the apartment. I already spoke to the building manager. Your name has been removed from the access list. You cannot do that. I pay for that apartment. You paid for it, Katerina corrected. Past tense. And according to the news, you will not be paying for much of anything for a while. The line went dead. Bennett stared at his phone. The cracked screen from when he had dropped it on the courthouse steps stared back at him, a spiderweb of fractures distorting his reflection. 2 years. He had spent 2 years with Katerina. Gifts, trips, the apartment in Tribeca, the car. He had been planning to propose after the divorce was finalized. He had imagined their life together, free from Margot's quiet judgment and endless disappointment. And now Katerina was gone. Evaporated the moment his credit limit hit 0. He should not have been surprised. He had chosen her precisely because she was uncomplicated. Because she wanted what he could provide and made no demands beyond that. It was a transaction, and transactions ended when the terms changed. But somehow, standing alone on the courthouse steps with his phone buzzing with notification after notification, he had expected something more. His phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Graves, this is Sandra Chen from the Wall Street Journal. Would you care to comment on allegations that Graves Development Corporation inflated quarterly earnings by approximately $180 million through accounting irregularities? We are running the story in tomorrow's edition. Before he could process this, another message appeared. Then another. Bloomberg, CNBC, the New York Times, the Financial Times. They all knew. Somehow, impossibly, they all knew. Bennett looked up from his phone and saw the first photographers gathering at the corner. Long lenses trained on his face like weapons. He turned away instinctively, trying to find an escape route. A taxi. He needed a taxi. He needed to get to the penthouse, to his private office, to the server that contained everything. If Irene's team got access to those files, if they found the spreadsheets detailing the adjustments he had made to the quarterly statements, he would not just be losing money. He would be facing federal prison. Bennett practically threw himself into the back of a cab. Upper East Side, he gasped. 872, Fifth Avenue. I will give you $500 if you get me there in 15 minutes. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, taking in his disheveled appearance, his sweat-dampened shirt, his wild eyes. You are that guy, the driver said. From the news. The one who got caught lying about his money. Just drive, Bennett snapped. The driver shrugged and pulled into traffic. Bennett spent the ride trying desperately to log into his company's administrative systems. He needed to delete files, destroy evidence, cover his tracks before Irene's forensic accountants could trace the irregularities back to their source. Access denied. User account suspended. He tried again. Same result. Someone had already locked him out. Someone inside the company had been waiting for the court order, finger poised over the button. The moment Judge Morrison's ruling came down, they had executed what must have been a prepared protocol. He had been outmaneuvered before the battle even began. The taxi screeched to a halt in front of his limestone mansion. Bennett threw a handful of bills at the driver without counting them and sprinted up the marble steps. He was fumbling with his keys when the door swung open from inside. A man stood in the doorway. Bennett recognized him immediately. Marcus Webb, the chief of security for Graves Development Corporation. A former FBI agent whom Bennett had personally recruited 5 years ago with a salary that would make most executives weep. Marcus, thank God. Bennett tried to push past him. I need to get to my office. The security system needs to be updated immediately. There may be unauthorized access to my files. Marcus did not move. Mr. Graves, he said, his voice professionally neutral. I cannot allow you to enter. Bennett blinked, certain he had misheard. Excuse me? This property is no longer in your name, Marcus continued. As of approximately 2 hours ago, Ownership has reverted to the Graves Sinclair Living Trust. Mrs. Margot Sinclair is now the sole trustee. I have orders to secure the premises and all digital assets contained within. Orders. Bennett laughed, a high, unhinged sound. I am your employer. I pay your salary. I am the one who gives orders. Not anymore, sir. Marcus's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been satisfaction. The board of directors held an emergency session this afternoon. You have been removed as CEO pending the completion of the SEC investigation. Mrs. Sinclair has been appointed interim chief executive. Bennett felt the world tilt beneath him. The board. His board. The men and women he had handpicked, cultivated, controlled for years. They had turned on him in a matter of hours. I need to speak to them, Bennett said. There has been a misunderstanding. If I could just explain. I am afraid that will not be possible, Marcus replied. Your access credentials have been revoked. Your company phone and laptop are being collected. Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered to a location of your choosing. He paused. I have been instructed to offer you transportation to a hotel of your choice. The Peninsula or the Four Seasons. Your room has been arranged. A hotel. Bennett repeated the word as if it were in a foreign language. You are kicking me out of my own house and sending me to a hotel. I am following the instructions I have been given, Mr. Graves. I take no pleasure in this. But even as he said it, Bennett could see that was not entirely true. Marcus had worked for him for 5 years. He had witnessed Bennett's treatment of employees, his casual cruelty to subordinates, his explosive rages when things did not go his way. This was not just professional duty. This was something closer to justice. Bennett looked past Marcus into the grand foyer of his home. Men in white gloves were carefully removing paintings from the walls. Others were photographing his furniture, his sculptures, his rare book collection. In the distance, he could hear the sound of someone opening his wine cellar, presumably to inventory the bottles. They are looting my house, he whispered. They are documenting marital assets, Marcus corrected. Standard procedure in high-value divorce proceedings. Bennett's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out automatically. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Graves, this is the Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Please contact us at your earliest convenience regarding an ongoing investigation. Bennett stared at the message. The words seemed to blur and swim before his eyes. Sir, Marcus said, not unkindly. I really do recommend you accept the transportation offer. There are reporters gathering at the end of the block. It would be better for everyone if you were not here when they arrive. Bennett looked up. In the distance, he could see the first news vans turning onto his street. He had no choice. Fine, he said, his voice hollow. The Peninsula. Marcus nodded and spoke into his earpiece. A black sedan pulled up to the curb moments later. Bennett climbed in without looking back at the house he had lived in for 12 years. The house where he had hosted presidents and celebrities and captains of industry. The house where he had felt, for the first time in his life, like he had truly arrived. It was not his anymore. Nothing was his anymore. The sedan pulled away from the curb, and Bennett Graves watched his life shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. The Peninsula Hotel gave him a suite on the 14th floor. It was luxurious by any normal standard, but to Bennett it felt like a prison cell. The walls pressed in. The silence was suffocating. He spent the first night making phone calls. He called his lawyer. His former lawyer. The one who had walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I am sorry, Bennett, Celia said, and she did not sound sorry at all. I cannot represent you. The potential criminal liability is too significant. I have already recommended several attorneys who specialize in white-collar defense. I suggest you contact them immediately. He called members of his board. Most did not answer. The few who did offered nothing but cool, professional distance. It is out of our hands, Bennett. The evidence is too substantial. We have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. I am sure you understand. He called his mother. She answered on the sixth ring, her voice thin and confused. "Bennett, it is nearly midnight. Is something wrong?" "Everything," he wanted to say. "Everything is wrong. I am losing everything." But the words would not come. He had spent his entire adult life presenting himself as invincible, as untouchable. He could not admit to his own mother that he had been brought low by a woman he had dismissed as irrelevant. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." She chatted for a few minutes about her garden, her bridge club, the weather in Florida. Normal things. Safe things. She had no idea that her son's face was all over the news, that his name had become synonymous with fraud and arrogance and spectacular downfall. He did not tell her. When he hung up, he sat in the darkness for a long time, watching the lights of Manhattan glitter through his window. He had built this city's skyline. His buildings rose from its streets, monuments to his vision and ambition. He had believed they would stand forever, testaments to his genius. Now he wondered if they would be torn down, renamed, erased, as if he had never existed at all. In the weeks that followed, Bennett learned what it meant to be truly alone. The federal investigation expanded. Subpoenas arrived at the hotel, served by stone-faced marshals who did not seem impressed by his expensive suits or his protestations of innocence. His new lawyers, a team of former prosecutors who charged even more than Celia had, delivered increasingly grim assessments. "The evidence is substantial," they told him. "The SEC has been building a case for months. Your mother-in-law's team appears to have been feeding them information since before the divorce proceedings began." Bennett thought about Irene Sinclair, the retired librarian who grew tomatoes and sent fruitcakes. The woman he had dismissed without a second thought for 18 years. She had been watching him the entire time. Waiting. Gathering evidence. Building a trap so elegant and so thorough that he had walked into it willingly, eagerly, convinced he was the one in control. The company continued to operate under Margot's leadership. Bennett followed the news obsessively, expecting to see reports of chaos and incompetence. Expecting to see proof that she could not handle the responsibility he had shouldered for so long. Instead, he saw stock prices stabilize. He saw announcements of new leadership appointments, promotions for people he had overlooked or dismissed. He saw statements about corporate restructuring, about ethical reforms, about a new direction for the company. He saw Margot give interviews, poised and articulate, speaking about transparency and accountability and the importance of building a business that employees could be proud of. She was good at it. Better than he wanted to admit. She had always been good at things, he realized. He had simply refused to see it. He remembered the first time they met, at the construction site of his first hotel. She had walked through the dust and debris as if she belonged there, speaking with quiet authority about art and atmosphere and the importance of intention. He had been impressed by her then. He had valued her opinion, sought her counsel, believed that her insights made his work better. When had that changed? He could not pinpoint the moment. It had happened gradually, like water wearing away stone. As his success grew, his need for her diminished. She became background. Furniture. Something to manage rather than partner with. He had stopped seeing her as a person. He had started seeing her as an accessory, a prop, a reflection of his own importance. And in doing so, he had missed everything. He had missed the intelligence she brought to every conversation. He had missed the competence with which she managed his increasingly complex household. He had missed the quiet strength that had allowed her to endure years of his dismissal and criticism without breaking. He had missed the woman she had always been, the woman who was now running his company with more grace and skill than he had ever managed. The woman he had thrown away. 3 months after the courtroom confrontation, Bennett's lawyers delivered their final assessment. "The prosecution has offered a plea agreement," they said. "If you cooperate fully, provide testimony regarding the accounting irregularities and the personnel involved, they will recommend a reduced sentence. 2 to 4 years in federal custody, followed by supervised release. Prison," Bennett said flatly. "Minimum security," his lawyer clarified. "It is the best outcome we can negotiate given the evidence. If this goes to trial, you are looking at 8 to 12 years. Bennett stared at the documents on the table. Legal filings, financial records, depositions. The accumulated weight of his decisions, his shortcuts, his willingness to bend rules he believed did not apply to him. 2 to 4 years, he repeated. It is a good deal, his lawyer said. Better than you deserve, frankly. Bennett looked up sharply. The lawyer met his gaze without flinching. I have been doing this for 30 years, he said. I have represented men like you before. Men who believed their success made them exempt from consequences. Men who were so convinced of their own importance that they could not imagine a world that would hold them accountable. He leaned back in his chair. This is what accountability looks like, Mr. Graves. 2 to 4 years. The loss of your company, your reputation, your freedom. This is the price of believing you were above the law. Bennett said nothing. He signed the plea agreement that afternoon. The minimum security facility was in Connecticut, a 90-minute drive from Manhattan. It looked more like a college campus than a prison, all low-slung buildings and manicured lawns. But it was still a prison. The doors still locked. The guards still watched. The days still stretched into an endless, monotonous blur. Bennett was given a room that he shared with another man, a former hedge fund manager who had been convicted of insider trading. They did not become friends. They tolerated each other's presence with a grudging acceptance of men who had nothing in common except their fall from grace. The first few months were the hardest. Bennett had never been still before, never had time to sit with his thoughts, never been forced to confront the person he had become without the distractions of work and wealth and constant motion. Now he had nothing but time. He thought about Margot constantly, not with anger or resentment, though he had expected those feelings to dominate. Instead, he thought about her with something closer to bewilderment. How had he missed so much? How had he spent 18 years with a woman and failed to understand who she actually was? He remembered the small moments now. The time she had tried to share something with him and he had dismissed her. The opinions she had offered that he had overridden without consideration. The way she had gradually stopped speaking, stopped trying, stopped being present in any way that might draw his attention. He had interpreted her silence as contentment, as submission, as proof that she understood her place. He had been wrong about everything. The news from outside arrived in fragments. His mother sent letters, carefully written to avoid mentioning anything that might upset him. His lawyer sent updates on the ongoing civil proceedings, the disposition of assets, the slow unwinding of the empire he had built. And occasionally, other inmates would mention something they had seen on television or read in a magazine. Something about Sinclair Properties, the new name for the company that had once borne his name. Something about the woman who ran it, the former wife of the disgraced founder, who had transformed the organization from within. Bennett collected these fragments and assembled them into a picture of a life continuing without him. A company thriving under new leadership. A woman stepping into her power after years of being diminished. He should have been angry. He should have felt robbed. Instead, he felt something closer to awe. 8 months into his sentence, Bennett received an unexpected visitor. He was called to the visiting room without warning, told only that someone was waiting for him. He assumed it was his mother. She had visited once before, sitting stiffly across from him in the sterile space, her eyes constantly darting to the clock. But the person waiting for him was not his mother. Irene Sinclair sat on the other side of the metal table, looking exactly as she had in the courtroom nearly a year ago. Impeccable suit. Perfect posture. Those penetrating gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Bennett stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" Irene gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Mr. Graves. I have something to tell you." Bennett hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse, to turn around and walk back to his cell, to deny her the satisfaction of whatever victory lap she had come to take. But another part of him, the part that had spent 8 months in the silence of his own thoughts, wanted to understand. Wanted to know why she had done what she did. Wanted to hear, from her own lips, the story he had been too arrogant to discover for himself. He sat. Irene regarded him for a moment without speaking. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice was calm and measured. "I do not gloat," she said. "That is not why I am here." "Then why?" "I wanted to see," Irene replied. I have spent my career watching men like you, investigating them, prosecuting them, dismantling the empires they built on deception. But I rarely see what happens afterward. The investigations end. The sentences are handed down. And then I move on to the next case. She tilted her head slightly. But this case was different. This case was personal. I wanted to see what prison does to a man who believed he was untouchable. And what do you see? Bennett asked the question without hostility. He genuinely wanted to know. Irene studied him for a long moment. I see a man who is finally asking questions, she said. That is more than most people in your position ever manage. Bennett looked down at his hands. The hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The hands that had built an empire. The hands that now spent their days making license plates in the prison workshop. I did not know, he said quietly. Irene waited. About you. About the investment. About any of it. He looked up. I spent 18 years married to your daughter, and I never once asked about her family. Never once wondered about her background. Never once considered that she might come from people who were my equals or my betters. He shook his head. I was so convinced of my own genius that I could not imagine anyone else might be operating on the same level. That was your first mistake, Irene agreed. Underestimating the people around you. Assuming that your success made you special, made you different, made you exempt from the rules that govern ordinary human beings. What was my second mistake? Irene smiled slightly. It was not a warm smile, but it was not entirely cold either. Your second mistake was treating my daughter the way you did. She loved you, Mr. Graves. 4 years, despite everything, she loved you. She defended you to me when I expressed concerns. She believed that beneath your arrogance and your cruelty, there was a man worth saving. Bennett felt something twist in his chest. And now? Now, Irene said, she does not think about you at all. The words hit harder than any of the legal proceedings, any of the financial losses, any of the public humiliation. She does not think about you at all. He had been erased. Not with anger or vengeance, but with simple indifference. He had become so insignificant to Margot that he did not even warrant the energy of hatred. Irene reached into her bag and withdrew a folded newspaper. She placed it on the table between them. Bennett looked at it. The business section of the Wall Street Journal. A headline about Sinclair Properties announcing a major expansion into sustainable development. A photograph of Margot at a podium, smiling with genuine confidence, looking every inch the leader she had become. She did not rename it at first, Irene said. The company. People told her she should. That she should distance herself from your legacy. But she decided the name was not the problem. The leadership was the problem. Bennett stared at the photograph. This woman he had dismissed. This woman he had diminished. This woman who had apparently been watching, learning, preparing for years while he assumed she was too simple to understand anything of importance. She kept most of your core team, Irene continued. The ones who were honest. The ones who tried to raise concerns that you ignored. She promoted people you overlooked. She settled with the SEC using her own portion of the divorce settlement. She implemented new financial controls that have become the industry standard. Irene's voice carried a note of pride. The stock price has fully recovered. The new Sustainable Development Division is partnering with 3 major universities. There is talk of recognition for the work being done on green building technologies. Bennett said nothing. What was there to say? She is remarkable, Irene said. She always was. You just refuse to see it. Bennett looked up from the newspaper. Does she? He started, then stopped. He was not sure he wanted to know the answer. But he asked anyway. Does she ever ask about me? Irene's expression did not change. No, Mr. Graves. She does not. The silence that followed was absolute. Bennett sat with the weight of those words settling over him. He had spent his whole life demanding attention, commanding rooms, ensuring that everyone around him was aware of his presence and his importance. And now the person who had known him most intimately had simply moved on. He was not even a wound that needed healing. He was a chapter that had been closed, a lesson that had been learned, a mistake that would not be repeated. He was nothing. "I came here to tell you something," Irene said finally. "Something I think you need to hear, even if you do not want to." Bennett looked at her. "You are not a monster," Irene said. "You are not uniquely evil. You are simply a man who was given too much power too quickly, who surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, and who gradually lost the ability to see anyone else's humanity." She leaned forward slightly. "That is not an excuse. It is an explanation. And it is the first step toward understanding what you did and why." Bennett felt something burning behind his eyes. He refused to let the tears fall. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because in 18 months, you will be released," Irene replied. "You will be 43 years old. You will have nothing except whatever skills and insights you have developed during your time here. And you will have a choice to make." "What choice?" "You can spend the rest of your life blaming others for your downfall. Your ex-wife, your mother-in-law, the prosecutors, the journalists, the system. You can nurture your grievances until they become the only thing you have left." She paused. "Or you can accept what happened, learn from it, and build something new." Bennett laughed bitterly. "Build something new? With what? My name is worthless. My reputation is destroyed. No one will ever trust me again." "You had nothing when you started," Irene pointed out. "A single rental property and an abundance of ambition. You built an empire from that. Not honestly, perhaps. Not ethically. But you built it." She stood. "You have the same capabilities now that you had then. The difference is that this time, you know the cost of building on a foundation of lies. This time, you have the opportunity to build something real." She gathered her bag and turned toward the door. "Mrs. Sinclair," Bennett said. Irene paused. "Why did you really come here?" "Not to lecture me about redemption. You are too practical for that." "So why?" Irene was quiet for a moment. "Because my daughter cannot," she said finally. "She has moved on. She has built a new life. Coming here, even to confront you, would give you a power over her that she has worked too hard to reclaim." Irene looked at him over her shoulder. "But someone needed to come. Someone needed to make sure you understood exactly what you lost and why. Consider it a final gift from the woman you threw away." She walked out without looking back. Bennett sat alone in the visiting room for a long time after she left. The newspaper remained on the table, Margot's photograph staring up at him with an expression he had never seen during their marriage. Confidence. Peace. Fulfillment. He had spent 18 years convinced that she needed him. That without his money, his status, his protection, she would be nothing. He had been wrong. She had never needed him. She had chosen him. And when he made that choice impossible, when he revealed through his cruelty and deception exactly who he really was, she had simply made a different choice. She had chosen herself. Bennett picked up the newspaper and studied her face. The woman he had married was still there, in the set of her jaw and the color of her eyes. But she was transformed. She was finally, fully, herself. He wondered if he would ever be able to say the same thing. On the day of Bennett Graves' release, 18 months after his sentencing, the weather was cold and gray. A light rain fell from clouds that seemed to press down on the Connecticut countryside, turning the prison's manicured lawns into patches of mud and mist. He walked out the front gate carrying a single duffel bag containing everything he now owned. A few changes of clothes. Some books he had read during his incarceration. A journal filled with thoughts he had never shared with anyone. There was no one waiting for him. No car, no driver, no assistant with a schedule and a list of urgent matters requiring his attention. His mother had offered to come, but he had asked her not to. He did not want witnesses to this moment. He did not want to perform recovery for anyone's benefit. He took a bus to the train station, then a train to Manhattan, then a taxi to a modest apartment in a neighborhood he never would have considered living in before his fall. The apartment had been arranged by his lawyers. It was small, clean, anonymous. The kind of place where no one would recognize him, where no one would care about his past or his failures. He unpacked his duffel bag. He made the bed. He stood at the window and looked out at the city he had once believed he owned. It looked different now. Not smaller, exactly, but more indifferent. The buildings rose and the traffic flowed and the people moved through their lives without any awareness of him at all. He was just another person in a city of millions. Just another story among countless stories. He found that he did not mind. Over the following months, Bennett began to build something new. Not an empire. Nothing so grand or so fragile. Just a life. He found work as a consultant for a small firm that helped struggling businesses restructure their operations. The pay was modest. The work was unglamorous. But it was honest, and there was satisfaction in helping people avoid the mistakes he had made. He reconnected with his mother, visiting her in Florida for the first time in years. He listened to her stories about bridge club and gardening. He helped her with repairs around her small house. He learned to be present in a way he had never been before. He thought about Margot often, but he did not try to contact her. What would he say? What could he possibly offer that would not be an intrusion, a demand for attention she had no obligation to give? He watched her from a distance instead. Read the articles about her company's continued success. Saw the occasional photograph in business publications. Noted the awards, the partnerships, the recognition she received for building something meaningful from the wreckage he had left behind. She looked happy. That was the thing he noticed most. Not triumphant, not vengeful, not performing success for an audience. Just genuinely, quietly happy. He was glad for her. That surprised him at first. He had expected to feel jealousy or resentment. But somewhere during his 18 months in prison, something had shifted. He had stopped seeing her as an extension of himself, a reflection of his own success or failure. He had started seeing her as a separate person with her own story, her own journey, her own right to happiness. It was the first time in his life he had truly seen anyone that way. 3 years after his release, Bennett Graves received an invitation. It was delivered to his modest apartment in an envelope that bore no return address. Inside was a single card, cream-colored and elegantly simple. You are invited to the Sinclair Foundation Annual Gala, a celebration of sustainable development and community reinvestment. The date, time, and location followed. A handwritten note at the bottom read simply, "You should come." There was no signature. But Bennett knew who had sent it. He thought about throwing the invitation away. What purpose could possibly be served by attending? He would be a spectacle, the disgraced ex-husband returning to the scene of his humiliation. People would stare. They would whisper. They would take photographs and post them online with mocking captions. But something made him keep the card. Something made him take it out and look at it every day as the gala approached. You should come. Someone thought he should be there. Someone who had no obligation to include him, no reason to want his presence. Someone who had every right to pretend he did not exist. On the night of the gala, Bennett put on the best suit he owned. It was not expensive by the standards of his former life, but it was clean and well-fitted. He took the train uptown, walked the final blocks to the venue, and stood outside for a long time before entering. The ballroom was filled with people he had once considered his peers. Captains of industry. Political leaders. Celebrities and philanthropists and the simply wealthy. They moved through the space in glittering clusters, their laughter and conversation filling the air with the sound of success. Bennett slipped in quietly, keeping to the edges of the room, trying not to attract attention. He did not succeed. The whispers started almost immediately. The glances, the pointed fingers, the phones discreetly raised to capture photographs. The disgraced founder of Graves Development, now Sinclair Properties, daring to show his face at his ex-wife's gala. Bennett ignored them. He was looking for someone. He found her near the center of the room, surrounded by well-wishers and business partners. Margot Sinclair, in a simple black dress that somehow managed to outshine every elaborate gown around her. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, styled in an elegant bob that framed her face. She was laughing at something someone had said, her whole face alight with genuine pleasure. She looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Margot excused herself from her companions and walked toward him. The crowd parted before her, and the whispers intensified, but she did not seem to notice. Her attention was fixed entirely on the man she had once loved, the man who had nearly destroyed her, the man she had not spoken to in more than 3 years. She stopped a few feet away. "You came," she said. "You invited me." A hint of a smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I was not sure you would." "Neither was I," Bennett admitted. They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the gala continued, but it felt distant, irrelevant. There was only this moment, this woman, this opportunity to say something true. "I am sorry," Bennett said. The words came out rough, unpracticed. "Not for getting caught. Not for losing everything. For how I treated you. For failing to see who you were. For making you smaller so I could feel bigger." Margot's expression did not change. "For years, I told myself that our marriage failed because you were not enough," Bennett continued. "Not ambitious enough, not impressive enough, not worthy of the life I was building. I told myself that story so many times that I believed it." He shook his head. "But it was never true. You were always more than enough. I was just too blind and too proud to see it." Margot was quiet for a long moment. "I spent years trying to be what you wanted," she said finally. "Trying to shrink myself into a shape you would approve of. I lost myself in that effort. And then I had to spend years finding myself again." She met his eyes directly. "I am not interested in your apology, Bennett. Not because I have not forgiven you. I have. But because my forgiveness is not about you. It is about me. It is about refusing to carry the weight of anger and resentment any longer." Bennett nodded slowly. "I understand. Do you know why I invited you tonight?" Bennett shook his head. "Because I wanted to see for myself," Margot said, "whether anything had changed. Whether the man who walked out of that prison was different from the man who walked into it." She studied his face with the same careful attention she had once given to works of art. "Is he?" Bennett considered the question. He thought about the 18 months in prison, the 3 years since. The work he had done. The person he was trying to become. "He is trying to be," he said finally. "I am not sure he will ever succeed entirely. But he is trying." Margot nodded slowly. "That is something," she said. "That is more than I expected." She turned to rejoin her guests, then paused. "There is someone you should meet," she said, "before you go." She gestured toward a corner of the room. An older woman sat there, silver-haired and elegant, watching the proceedings with sharp gray eyes. "Irene Sinclair. She would like to speak with you," Margot said. "If you are willing." Bennett looked at the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. The woman who had spent 11 years waiting for him to reveal his true character. The woman who had visited him in prison to deliver a message he still thought about every day. He was not sure he was ready for another conversation with Irene Sinclair. He was not sure he would ever be ready. But he found himself walking toward her anyway. Irene did not stand when he approached. She simply gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Sit down, Mr. Graves. You look like you could use a drink." Bennett sat. A waiter appeared immediately, offering champagne. Bennett declined. He had not touched alcohol since his release. It seemed like a small discipline, but it mattered to him. Irene nodded approvingly. "You are different," she observed. "I am trying to be." Irene studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through any pretense. "My daughter tells me you have been working as a consultant," she said, "helping small businesses avoid financial difficulties. It is not glamorous work." "No," Irene agreed. "But it is honest. And it requires understanding things from the perspective of people who are struggling, not just people who are succeeding." She paused. "That is a skill you did not have before." Bennett considered this. "I never had to think about struggling," he admitted. "Even when my company was on the verge of bankruptcy, I believed I would find a way out. I believed that success was my destiny and failure was just a temporary obstacle." He looked at his hands. I did not understand that most people do not have that luxury. Most people live with uncertainty every day. Most people have to work and sacrifice and compromise without any guarantee that it will pay off. And now? Now I understand it a little better, Bennett said. Not fully. Maybe not ever fully. But better. Irene was silent for a long moment. I spent my career investigating men like you, she said finally. Men who believed their success made them special, made them exempt from the rules that govern ordinary people. Most of them never changed. They went to prison and came out exactly as they went in, still convinced they were the victims of persecution rather than the architects of their own downfall. She tilted her head. But occasionally, very occasionally, I encountered someone who used their time differently, who asked questions they had never asked before, who began to see themselves and others with new eyes. She leaned forward. You seem to be one of those rare individuals, Mr. Graves. Whether that change is genuine or merely a performance, only time will tell. But the early signs are encouraging. Bennett met her eyes. Why does it matter to you? He asked. Whether I change or not. I am no longer a threat to your daughter. I have nothing you want. Why do you care what happens to me? Irene's expression softened, just slightly. Because my daughter loved you once, she said. And despite everything you did, despite all the ways you hurt her, she still believes that people can change. She still believes that the capacity for growth exists in everyone, even those who have demonstrated the worst of human nature. She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her stern features. I am more skeptical than she is. I have seen too much. But I would like to believe she is right. I would like to believe that the years she spent with you were not entirely wasted, that something good might eventually emerge from all that pain. She stood. Take care of yourself, Mr. Graves. And do not waste this second chance. They are rarer than you know. She walked away without waiting for a response. Bennett sat alone in the corner of the ballroom, watching the gala continue around him. He watched Margot move through the crowd, gracious and confident, comfortable in her own skin in a way he had never seen during their marriage. He watched Irene rejoin her daughter, the two of them standing together with the easy intimacy of family. He thought about the man he had been. Arrogant, certain, convinced of his own importance. He thought about the man he was now. Humbled, uncertain, trying to find his way. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would ever fully overcome the legacy of his failures. He did not know if he would ever build something as grand as the empire he had lost. But he knew, with a clarity he had never possessed before, that the measure of a life was not in its monuments, not in the buildings that bore your name or the billions in your bank account. The measure of a life was in the people you treated with kindness, the relationships you built with honesty, the legacy you left in hearts rather than in headlines. He had failed at all of those things during his first life. But he was still alive. He still had time. He could still choose differently. Bennett Graves stood up, straightened his modest suit, and walked out of the gala. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He did not seek attention or acknowledgement. He simply left, stepping out into the cool night air of Manhattan, into a city that no longer knew his name. And for the first time in his life, he found that he did not mind being anonymous. He found that there was freedom in insignificance. He found that starting over, with nothing but the lessons of failure to guide you, was not a punishment. It was a gift. The city spread out before him, lights glittering in countless windows, lives being lived in ways he would never know. He was one small person in an ocean of humanity. He was nothing special. He was no one important. And that was exactly as it should be. This is the story of a man who had everything and lost it all. Not through bad luck or unfair persecution, but through the accumulated weight of his own cruelty, his own arrogance, his own inability to see the humanity in the people around him. It is also the story of a woman who was systematically diminished by someone who claimed to love her, who lost herself in the effort to become what he wanted, who found, in the ashes of her marriage, the strength to become who she was always meant to be. And it is the story of a mother who watched and waited, who built protections she hoped would never be needed, who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be patient, be prepared, and be ready to act when the moment comes. Bennett Graves believed he was the hero of his own story. He believed that his vision, his ambition, his genius set him apart from ordinary people. He believed that the rules of human decency were for lesser mortals, not for titans like himself. He was wrong. The rules apply to everyone. Kindness matters. The people we dismiss as unimportant are often the ones who hold our fate in their hands. And when we build our lives on a foundation of lies, the collapse is not a matter of if. It is only a matter of when. Margot Sinclair did not defeat her husband through confrontation or vengeance. She defeated him by surviving, by enduring, by quietly gathering the strength and the knowledge she would need when the moment finally came. And when that moment arrived, when her husband revealed the full extent of his cruelty and deception, she did not have to fight. She simply had to stand still and let him destroy himself. That is the truth about justice that the arrogant never understand. It does not require spectacle. It does not require violence. It does not require the dramatic confrontations of movies and television. Real justice is quiet. It is patient. It is inevitable. And it comes for everyone eventually. Even those who believe they are untouchable. Even those who think the rules do not apply. Even those who have spent their whole lives convinced that kindness is weakness and cruelty is strength. The reckoning always comes. And when it does, there is nothing left but the consequences of every choice we have ever made. Bennett Graves learned this lesson the hard way. He lost his money, his company, his reputation, his freedom. He lost the woman who loved him and the life he had built on her labor and her sacrifice. But in the end, he found something he had never possessed before. He found humility. He found clarity. He found the beginning of wisdom. Whether it was enough, whether he could build something meaningful from the wreckage of his former life, remained to be seen. But for the first time, he was trying. And sometimes, trying is enough. The end.